This program has been approved for one IDCEC CEU. To receive credit for this program, please submit your full name, IDCEC number, program class code, and your summary essay to ceu@iida.org. The program class code is located alongside the title of this program on the IIDA Academy page. For a certificate of completion to use toward another certifying body, please submit the same information to ceu@iida.org. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Cheryl Durst, the CEO of IIDA, and on behalf of our wonderful partner, the Mohawk Group, I'm pleased to welcome you to the Believe in Better Roundtable series. Today, we're talking about human-centered design in education, technology, and anthropology. My favorite bit of housekeeping is to introduce my friend Royce Epstein, who is going to be joining me as a co-moderator, and Royce is the A&D design director for Mohawk Group. Hey, Royce.
Hi, Cheryl. Hi, everybody. So nice to be here. So nice to see you, Cheryl.
Yeah, it's good to see you too on this wonderful, I'm hoping sunny where you are Thursday.
Not quite sunny, but it's Thursday. We can confirm that.
But it's Thursday. We can indeed confirm that. So I'm excited about this discussion.
Yes, me too. Just so our guests out there know, this is second in a series. Our first discussion was focused on workplace, and today we're going to talk to some experts in the education segment. So I'm really excited to introduce our first two panelists. We have Patricia Bow, who is principal and co-director of the education practice at Canon Design, and she's based in Washington, D.C. And we have Dave Broz, who's a principal at Gensler in Chicago. So welcome to those two panelists.
Right. And also a welcome to Fiona Grandowski, who is a principal with Collins Cooper Carusi in Atlanta. And Fiona is also a member of the International Board of Directors with IIDA. Hey, Fiona. And our fourth panelist is bringing a quite an interesting perspective to this conversation. Dr. Lauren Herckis is an anthropologist. She's with Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, and she's working at the intersection of education and technology. And today's conversation, hi, Dr. Lauren. Today's conversation, we're going to talk about kind of this shifting landscape of education. And we're going to talk about space, both real space and virtual space, although if it's virtual, that doesn't make it any less real. But you know, this year we've all experienced quite a radical change in educations. We've all had to adapt, just as institutions have had to adapt to different models of learning. And we wanted to, with this group, kind of take a moment to look at the now and next of space and place and technology and education. And so our panel of experts are going to help us have that conversation. And how about we get started? We ready? We always like to ask this question of everybody because we feel that it's really important to simply ask, how is everybody doing? How is work? How is life? Let's just do a check-in and let's get started. Fiona, can I get started with you? How are you doing?
Sure. I'm doing well. I think that as with everybody, it's been more than an interesting year, and now it's continuing to be a second year of the pandemic. But I see bright light in the future. So I'm excited. I think that there is a horizon, one that we've talked about for a long time. So life may be stressful, but life is also good.
Awesome. I love to hear that. Patricia, how are you? How are you doing? How's life and work for you?
You know, in the scheme of things, there's a lot that I could say, but honestly, it's right. I mean, the world is kind of crazy right now. It's been for the last 18 months from all directions, and we talked about this a little bit the last couple of weeks when we met. I think there's like little silver linings. I'm just so lucky to be home at this point with my kids. I know a lot of people can't say that. I'm lucky, but again, I used to be on an airplane 4 days a week, and it's been really great. I mean, we have a horse, we have a dog now. Like, there's things that I couldn't fathom before, my colleagues know, and now it's like part of my day to day, right? So it's been really great.
I love that. I love your characterization of, instead of just one big silver lining, we all have a collection of silver linings. That's well said. Dr. Lauren, how are you? How's work? How's life? How's the business of people and anthropology?
Man, everybody is in their own little boxes places now, not only on Zoom, but, you know, so many people are spending time in spaces in ways that they never had before, that it's really just been a transformative year. It really has, in so many different ways. For some people, much more challenging than others. And so I just feel lucky to be where I am right now. And yeah, really interested to see where education goes from here, given the transformative nature of this year.
Indeed. And Dave, how are you?
Hello, everybody. Doing great. Listen, I'm similar to Patricia. I replaced airplanes with Little League sports coaching. So I took all the extra hours that I was gone from the family, and I'm coaching 5 youth sports leagues this spring.
Oh, wow.
Might have overdone it a couple, but I did not get a pandemic horse. So I'm glad.
Great.
Yeah. Wow. You are a sports overachiever, Dave. Thank you for that. So let's talk a little bit about this kind of post-vaccination world. I can't quite say a post-pandemic world, but we can certainly talk a little bit about the post-vaccination world. And many schools are kind of working through trying to figure out reconnecting with their communities, with students. There's the conversation about, you know, are we virtual? Are we hybrid? What are we? What are you all hearing from clients about kind of the current state of affairs in education? Let's start with a big general macro question. Patricia, do you want to start us off?
Sure. I think I think this idea of experience is the one that I keep hearing about. It's this race, and even when the pandemic hit, well, we know that the pandemic sort of turned everything upside down education-wise, right? But it was already a fragile system. And I think that even when the pandemic hit, everybody was thinking what was going to be post-pandemic. Now we're talking about what's post-vaccine. I think the back to normal isn't something that I'm hearing as much about as the idea of how can we deliver an experience, and whether it's in the K-12 world. And Dr. Herckis, we started talking about this last week when we were together, is about sort of this race to what's the value system of that experience. So in higher education, it's a business at the end of the day. And so how can I offer an experience that's going to meet a sort of a value system that then we can actually have a catchment, right? And I think, again, it just came out last night, so I haven't totally formulated those thoughts, right? But this idea about free community college, right? It's been, you know, in the president's State of the Union yesterday. So not State of the Union, but addressing Congress. So I think it's a really interesting time to think about what is that experience, right? We were just talking about it now in terms of workplace, right? For all of us.
Yeah, it's really interesting to think, especially about access in community colleges in the past year, because so many access-oriented schools, and you know, that's not necessarily community colleges and vice versa, but so many schools that prioritize bringing in all of the students who want access to college also serve populations that have limited access to campuses or to technologies. And so a move to online and hybrid learning has changed the equation for equity and access. And you know, this idea of tuition support will as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Fiona?
So actually, that's Patricia. So everybody's learning something today, because that was the first that I'd heard of that. And that definitely is an interesting thought process about what's coming. I think that, you know, what I'm hearing for schools is that it's not back to business as normal, but it is back, specifically for K through 12, it's definitely being back. It's about getting children back in classrooms, back in a space where they can learn in ways that we don't think about learning, that we all think about listening to the teacher, writing our homework and so forth. We forget about all of the, what in business starts to fall into soft skills of what we mimic and what we see and what kids are learning between the lines that is so, so difficult to do in a virtual world. And so back is definitely part of this, but how do we come back and still maintain the positives that did come out of COVID, and how do we do it across the board equitably for all communities? So it will be a very interesting next 5 years because it's not going to happen overnight.
Fiona, sorry, Dave, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, I was going to ask a question, so if you want to comment.
I was going to build on that because I would say that, in every industry that's out there, we've said the pandemic has accelerated trends. The dual channel shopping, the Netflix and kind of, not going to the movie theater type of stuff has just exploded overnight. And it actually did what education's been trying to do for decades and provide some sort of remote learning platform. But I think it's also highlighted the inequalities that are the system. And you hear stories about, having to spend just as much time getting instructors on board with Zoom and converting their lesson plan to a digital platform, or even access to broadband and technology that allows their camera to be live in some of our remote communities, whether it's K through 12 or universities. So while it allowed us to achieve something literally overnight in March of 2020 that we've been trying for decades to do, it proved that we haven't quite gotten as far as we need to, as far as equal access to that learning.
Yeah, it's exposed some massive craters in terms of actually the continuing education for teachers. We don't think about teachers needing to continue to learn to teach. And this has just opened it wide to say, yes, everybody needs continuing education if we're going to maintain where the trajectory of society is going.
Great point.
That's a great.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say that's a wonderful point. And I think, there are some structures in place in K-12 education for, for teachers education to support learning about new technologies and pedagogies in new kinds of spaces. In post-secondary education, there really just, there isn't that kind of structure, and professors and instructional faculty in colleges and universities often start teaching with one idea of how to teach and one skill set, and then that's what they carry through the next 20, 30, 40 years of teaching. And it's really interesting to think about how in post-secondary education we can support schools and educators in developing those new skills that they really clearly need.
And I think that's a great segue to the question that I do want to ask, which is, if teachers have been teaching maybe in one methodology for a long time, and now we've had all this disruption with trying to figure out how to leverage technology, what happens to the actual physical classroom? So, there's shifting ideas about what classrooms and education spaces might look like as we go back to school, whether it's, in this coming semester in the fall, or, a few years out. So how do you guys see that? Like, are you talking with your clients about that? Are you envisioning how these physical spaces are going to change now that we've been through what we've been through?
Take that. That's really interesting. I think what is happening is, again, it's that speed that this pandemic has sort of upset everything, and everybody's relooking at all of their real estate, right? That's a little bit of what Dave was talking about, sort of challenging any preconceptions they had about things. And now we're really looking at that idea of hybrid workplace, right, for the administrators and the faculty, and that don't need to be front facing, and we're looking at repositioning classroom space and really making spaces on campus that are those really great bespoke kind of learning labs that take a lot of infrastructure, that all that simulation, all those simulation spaces that are again very much part of the culture of instruction right now. in a lot of programs, and that's what's being dedicated to on-campus experience. And then learning that, I mean, it's not quite a MOOC, right? MOOCs sort of got all this hype in the early aughts, and then now they're not really, that's not what we're doing. We're doing a sort of a hybrid where we've learned how to deliver certain things remotely, because it does work, right? You can catch more people. It touches, you know, sort of that hits on our points or our discussion about equity. And then you bring people together to do those really, really, truly, like I said, bespoke things on campus that you can't replicate in this kind of a medium, at least today, right, for the foreseeable future. Mm-hmm. So that's really what again, our discussions with our clients are around.
Yeah, I have a client, a provost, that has one of my favorite quotes of all time, and it was, you know, March 16th, when it was announced they were going remote, the initial reaction from the entire student body and all the faculty was, this can't work. And a few weeks later, she checked in with them and they said, all right, it can work, but we like being in person better. And then by the end of the semester, the feedback was, all right, these classes are actually better online. These should be in person. And I think if a university or even a K through 12 can begin to assess what worked better in a virtual environment, what didn't work better in a virtual environment, and then begin to look at their facilities moving forward from that point with that lens.
Exactly.
Do you think that we will, and this gets back to Patricia, to your point, like, do you think that we'll start de-densifying schools and classrooms? So maybe not packing 40 kids in a room. I mean, hopefully no one's doing that now, but in high schools.
Yeah, I mean, I think the days of the 200-seat auditorium are kind of waning, right? I can't see, again, other than for an event, right, where you're picking up on that vibe of being together, but to deliver instructional, I mean, again, Dr. Herckis, you live this, to deliver instruction, it just doesn't seem like, frankly, for a student, much less for, there's going to be a whole generation that's not expecting to get instructed that way. And then there's a whole generation of instructors and faculty that are going to expect not to instruct that way either. So it'll be really interesting. So I do think it will be, and I don't know that it'll be de-densified by FTE, right, people, but not necessarily square footage. The square footage will get reappropriated to other things.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question. It's like, what would the strategy be? But I think you answered that.
Yeah, I would build on that. I don't think there's going to be a square foot reduction. I don't think there's going to be much of a square foot growth unless if enrollment dictates it. But instead of there being that, 300 to 500, 1,000 person lecture hall, you might need to create some more one-button studios or lightboard studios where teachers have easy access. And while the last year has been cute, having everyone on their iPad or on their laptop, I think the next term is going to require much more sophisticated broadcast engagement studios. And I'm not talking about, significant lighting. It's basically a faculty office that you put a green screen on in an iMac and you're able to record these sessions. Or if you look up, the Northwestern University professor invented this, what's called Lightboard Studio, and you basically write on a piece of glass in front of you and the camera on the other side mirrors you. So you look like you can write backwards as fast as you can write forward, but it's just technology that's switching it. And so what's powerful about that is in the pre-pandemic age, professors were using that when they were live in person teaching, and there was a topic that the students didn't quite comprehend. They were able to go in the Lightboard Studio, push the record button, it created a 2-minute video, it sends out to the students, and the teacher can say, hey, I think you missed this point. Here, I described it a little bit more. If every academic building had one of those, can you imagine an increase of engagement that could happen? I can't even count the number of times in a class environment that I missed something. But if the professor was that proactive to providing these snippets of learning after the fact, what an increased engagement that could be.
So I think that all of this needs to happen, but I think there is also a threshold in terms of age. When you're talking about middle school and younger, I think that the balance of virtual to in-person is not only affecting the student, it's affecting the entire family. And so now you have to bring the family into this discussion of how do you manage virtual education when K through 12 for generations has been what has supported people to work. So it not only educates your children, but it enables you to work. And for those that are also have food insecurity, it is provided food. So schools offer so much more than than just education. They are community partners in what we do every single day. And so I think that we really have to balance it when you're talking about K through 12. University is going to be quite a different story, and it's going to look a lot more like our workplace, quite honestly.
I think that is such an important point. We think about what is education, and often people are thinking about the learning goals. What do we want students to learn during this quarter or semester or year? Whereas, especially when we're talking about early childhood or elementary education, but not only early childhood and elementary education, also middle school and high school, the educational systems serve educational purposes, but are also as you said, community partners. They address food insecurity, all kinds of vital therapies and social services. They are where students and families get so many different kinds of supportive services and access to different kinds of care. And I think that I don't think that this is yet as widely acknowledged or recognized as it should be, but I think that right now there's a new awareness of the extent to which families rely on schools for this whole suite of services and supports.
Absolutely.
And can't be disentangled from one another. If we're getting certain kinds of support somewhere else, then they don't have to accrue to the school. Or, if we're going to count on the school to provide, say, social workers, then let's make sure that those services are also present, right? So I think that this is a fertile opportunity to recognize the diverse kinds of supports and services that education has historically provided and make sure that they're met, individually as well as in concert.
Great points. What you're all touching on in some way, shape, or form moves us toward a larger conversation around equity. And Dave, I thought your point about, you were starting to touch on access. And as we move beyond this very situational reactive moment to the pandemic and then move into what's next, we know that for a lot of students, and whether that's in K through 12 or higher ed, there's been this unprecedented access to programs. You hear about fourth graders being able to tour the Louvre virtually, right, in a class, or you hear about, kind of small rural community colleges getting Nobel Prize winning poets or physicists lecturing to their classes virtually, right? They're not paying into a big speaker series to make that happen. But it also brings to bear, as the pandemic has been so revelatory, what about students who don't necessarily have that degree of access, right? The bandwidth just isn't there. Fiona, you mentioned food insecurity. What about technology insecurity? How will we begin to kind of close those gaps? Because hybrid may be here to stay. And how do we amplify the environment or technology for those students who haven't historically, had that access? Any thoughts or any conversations that you all are having about how that plays into the education models we're talking about?
I think this is huge. I think that the access, so as a system-wide, countrywide, access will have to continue to be developed and integrated. And we, across the country, neighborhoods, communities, cities found that they didn't have enough bandwidth for everybody to suddenly go home and go online. But I think that even with bandwidth improving, that still the actual technology, the computers, the iPads, whatever. The other thing that, the disappearance of schools as being community partners, but also after school care, programs like the Boys and Girls Club that we're no longer able to offer what they offer, that we have to figure out how to fill this gap so that these opportunities and that there is access for as many people as possibly can be provided.
And I think
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, please.
I shared with you all about how I had heard a podcast. I think it was the Dallas Independent School Districts, right? The superintendent of Dallas schools had, yeah, it was one thing to say, here's one-on-one tablets for everybody, but then if you can't get online. So again, it goes back to this sort of infrastructure program that we have as part of the discourse politically right now. Even in Baltimore, I think when the pandemic hit, Micah and Johns Hopkins and University of Baltimore got together and set up towers, right? Nobody realized how much bandwidth was needed to have every single student in a catchment needing to get online. So again, I think it's one of those silver, maybe we can see that even as a silver lining. Like this broke so many things and it made everything, it sort of exposed so many things as being fragile that needed attention. I think, Lauren, you touched on Dr. Herckis. I'm sorry, just to
No, please call me Lauren.
You touched on the sort of the safety net, right? Well, there's so many women that dropped out of the workforce in this pandemic, and because it was the women who somebody had to stay home, right? And traditionally that's who stayed home, right? And you're not only caring for your children, you're caring for, it's a you're in the sandwich here. So I think it's just really interesting. I think it's, like you said, it's an opportunity. I think we have an amazing opportunity right now to try to really sort of right a lot of wrongs.
And each of these things, absolutely, and each of these things that are, exposed or broken reveal this kind of cascading set of interdependencies, right? We need the towers because there's insufficient broadband, but you get the tower and the tablet, and then does anyone in the household, especially if you're talking about a kindergartner or a first grader, know how to use that type of device, or know what to do if something goes wonky, or know who to get in touch with if the platform isn't working, or which app is supposed to be used when. So there's the technological infrastructure, there's the implementation, there's how to support the pedagogies that the instructor or the school district has chosen, and none of those are trivial questions. They all take specialized knowledge. And if we're going to put that question or that burden in the hands of someone who has made the choice or been forced into staying home to be a supportive parent who's trying to help a kid through school, perhaps instead of going to work, how does that skill set get communicated? Or how does that parent get supported as they're trying to support their child? And I mean, all of these interdependencies are complex. This is a really sticky, multidisciplinary question that requires a lot of different minds and expertise to try and disentangle. And the fact that people are seeing now all of these different parts of the problem is hugely valuable. It's terrible and it's challenging and it's been destructive for so many people in so many different ways. And it's also the first time I think that a lot of folks who are able to build those towers are aware of those interdependencies and the need to try and start thinking through how to meet it.
It feels like in the conversations we have about education, we talk about physical space and we talk about technology, almost like they're two separate things. Dr. Lauren, you were just talking about the kind of codependency and this deeper intertwining.
Yeah.
Obviously, the pandemic is causing us to think about it more, but how can we further think about, and how can the folks on the panel who are design professionals further have these conversations with their clients about this intertwining of physical space and technology and co-design when we talk about it, as opposed to two separate things?
Yeah, I think co-design is the biggest question, right? Thinking about not only who will be using the space in an institutional context, but also, what are the instructors bringing to the space? Who are the students? Who are the people who are supporting the technological infrastructure? All of these different specialists play a role in creating an educational experience where there is a teacher or teachers, and there are students, and there are people supporting the students in various ways. And each of these different stakeholders have different specialized knowledge that really needs to inform a design process so that we don't run into the same problems over and over again, so that someone recognizes early in the process that, well, some people don't have access to broadband, or you give a person a device and the internet access and they're still some pedagogical knowledge, some technological skill, and some other factors that need to be considered. Yeah, I mean, I think these conversations are happening, and there's so much interesting research that's taking place right now that I think in a year and 2 years and 10 years, there's so much more that we'll know about how to do this well. But I think these are the kinds of conversations we need to just keep having to make sure everybody is aware of the different kinds of interdependencies.
I think the issue with technology and space is, and for the design professionals on the panel, as well as in your audience, technology is moving at a different pace. So while and then Dr. Herckis, when you said about the who that we're talking about when we're solving a problem at the beginning is not the who at the other side. You know,
That's
again,
right.
it might be a faculty member might stick around or a teacher, but the student is passing through. So we always talk about, oh, you know, that problem will go away in 4 years in higher education. Right? But again, I don't know that. And so it's just the technological advances and what is happening and what kind of platforms and what kind of software. Like you could design for all the bells and whistles,
Yeah.
and then 2 years later, when you're opening the building, or 3 years, let's say it's a year-long design phase, it takes 2 years to build something.
Yep.
It's a completely different animal. So
That's
it's
such an important point.
a shell, right? And then the shell could be almost anything, but that's also not how funding works. So there's all these interdependencies that, again, it's an ecosystem, right? So again, I'm sure Dave and Fiona might have something to offer on that, but that's the part where it is separate, but it's also, I'm sorry, it is together, but they're not moving at the same rate at all.
Well, that's students and also technology and also ideas about pedagogy and how we should teach and how people are learning. And, you know, now surely also ideas about, you know, the social context of the classroom and the public health context of the classroom. You know, part of the idea of dedensifying is in response to thinking about these public health questions. And that's gonna be a different landscape 2 months from now, let alone 2 years from now. So yeah, there are so many different moving targets.
Yeah, and especially, sorry, go ahead, Dave.
Well, I would say that about where we're at in the world today, though, is that 10 years ago, if a client were to come to us and say, I need rooms that students can do online learning, we would have built them 4 walls, a door, and a ceiling. And where furniture has accelerated in the last 10 years, we can now accommodate that space need with a piece of furniture. So when we talk about rapid iteration of change and how technology is changing so much faster than the human or the built environment, I think we're better prepared today than we were 10 years ago. And the reality that we're seeing, especially on the university side, is that a student might have an in-person class at 9 o'clock and have a virtual class at 11 o'clock and an in-person class at 1 o'clock. So their life is being flipped back and forth. And our faculty need to work harder now because we have to accommodate those 20 students somewhere on campus to have some focus time to take that online class, because they're not going to go back home to their dorm or their apartment and then come back to campus. But again, I just think that we don't have to build as much physical walled space as we did just a decade ago. There are so many other options that are out there in the marketplace right now that allow for focused space within an open environment.
Yeah, and I think flexibility is key in so many different ways as well, right? You know, there are classroom contexts right now where there is a teacher teaching in-person students and remote students and in-person students who are engaging with the remote students, and thinking about how to accommodate all of these different kinds of interactions when technologically we know that the tools and platforms are going to be different in 6 months, right? So planning for change is a fundamentally different proposition, but you know, increasingly important.
So how can we actually untether our classrooms? How can we bring the technology in that we need and change the technology
That's wonderful.
as it changes? And that's you know, where we've seen that working really successfully has given us the most flexibility. So I mean, as soon as we have wireless power, then we can totally untether. But to be able to have technology that is flexible and fluid, moves into a classroom or out of a classroom, because at the same time that we're seeing technology being this huge foundation for education, we're also seeing other modes of education becoming much more desirable, which is hands-on. Get rid of the technology. Start to get your students to really think through problems, not just hunt for solutions. So I think that there's so much going on at the same time, and every client is looking for something similar, but a little bit different. And we need to be able to think about all of these things.
Yeah, and that's a great point, Fiona. I've been thinking a lot about, and Patricia, you hit on this too a little bit, there's a financial component, especially for higher ed universities. What happens when their tuition drops and kids are not coming back to campus? I know my own school, I went to Sarah Lawrence, is very small liberal arts school, was sort of having discussions and in peril of, can we even reopen next year? And I think a lot of campuses are going through that. So, it makes me wonder, like, is it the place that makes the school, or is it the community that makes the school? And this is an interesting time to think about that because of all of these factors. Like I'm teaching right now, I think I told you guys, I'm teaching now at Drexel and my class is 100% online. I have 27 students. It's really hard to connect with 27 students on Zoom, as you can imagine. And I'm also teaching textiles, which is all about tactility, right? And it's, again, really hard to do that on Zoom. So, when I used to teach something similar in person, it was a very, very different experience, and culturally a different experience than it is, having these conversations digitally. And even the homework and the way they deliver their homework is completely different. And so it's been a real challenge to kind of foster community and foster culture when I don't have a physical place, even though Drexel, of course, is a physical university that luckily is thriving and doing well. Sorry, that's a big question with a lot of stuff here. But
I think what's powerful about that is, like, we took a long time to transition from Sage on Stage to a guide by the side. And that was a big shift in the pedagogy of learning. And part of it, in my opinion, was fueled by the fact that students all had personal in their hands. Teachers said something, they could fact check it really quick and be like, that's not exactly what that means. And to some extent, the pandemic and the shift to Zoom has forced us to resort back to a one-directional teaching style. And so what I love by what Fiona said, she said, disconnect from technology to solve the problem rather than answer. And at the end of the day, that's what learning is. Learning isn't just about regurgitating what you've learned, but using the knowledge to almost create new knowledge based on the fact people that are assembled in a space. I think that's pretty powerful. And I think Zoom might actually facilitate that more because you can get more diversity. I mean, look at the panel today. We're from all different states. And I just think there's a huge positive with this remote connectivity that we've explored in the past 12 months.
I agree. I think that there are so many tremendous possibilities here. And part of it is that, so I'm also teaching online, and it's really challenging to build connection. But there is a lot of research about the importance of building a sense of community and belonging in a classroom in order to really enhance the educational experience. And there are ways to do that in remote education. There's even research on it that predates the pandemic. But most of us, it's unfamiliar. If you're in a room with people, building a relationship is, I won't say intuitive, because for many people it's not, but there's a lot there that's simply human, right? And there's a lot that the pedagogy is related to belonging and inclusion resonate for people who are comfortable in social situations, because it's very similar in a lot of ways to going into any other kind of room and getting to know people and drawing them into a conversation or a practice. And when we all made a rapid transition to online teaching last spring, it's not the same and it's not intuitive. And so people have had to learn those pedagogies of inclusion and belonging. And many of us still are, because it's new, it's novel, right? But I think that there are pedagogies and techniques and technologies, and there is a lot of research that can help us build those kinds of experiences that are perhaps even more inclusive or more appropriately tuned to remote learning. It's a matter of this question of education, right? How do we learn how to use these tools and technologies in these novel contexts to their best effect, and when? Because there are some things, I can't feel the texture of a textile remotely. It's just not something that's possible right now. So that takes a whole re-envisioning of what remote learning might look like. So in what contexts can we learn these new pedagogies? And in what context do we need to simply re-envision what that education might look like?
This is such an amazing conversation, and this first portion has flown by, and we're going to move into our next segment with our breakout groups. What did everybody talk about in their breakout room? How did you approach the questions? How did they get answered?
Should we go through all the scribes? We go through each. Okay, Denise, do you want to start? In our room we had Denise.
Hello, we had a nice group and a really good conversation. So when we started talking about the future of education in place, the thoughts that came to mind, everyone agreed that flexibility was key. It was almost required because we need to be able to do different things and transition easily while we're going into different learning modes and such. We talked about needing to increase awareness that schools are also serving multi-purpose, the community function, the supportive services. So that's really part of the future of how to probably continue to deliver those kinds of things. With respect to place, we all felt like you still will be wanting to go to a place. You'll still have a reason to go to a place. It will always exist. It's just going to be, you're always going to have that brick and mortar, but it's going to be how we're using it. And back to kind of that education it takes a village, and we're increasingly aware that conversations around the future of education will have to include all these ideas. And community and collaboration are very important. We're always aware that than ever the need to be co-located for some activities. Like we're always going to want to be together for certain activities. We also talked about how technology is going to fill in some gaps, and we're going to continue to try to learn different ways of learning.
Great. That was awesome. What about another group? Thank you, Denise. Another group want to report out?
Hey, why don't I go?
Sure. Oh, go ahead, Mark.
I made some notes. So, I think there was conversation there about what's right, what is the education model that's right by age group, but also by individual students. So, a Zoom-only experience is not right for every student. Some students have clearly accelerated, some have really declined where we've been. There may exist a hybrid model, but it may exist more in the collegiate world than it does in K through 12 or through high school. The idea that, not only do we learn consciously by what we see presented to us, but there's also subconscious, and the idea that, you take cues from social experiences that we have within a classroom environment. There are learning episodes there that are very different than just reading things on a PowerPoint or text and a textbook. So the need for K through 12 to go back and through high school, I think, is where the world will eventually have to be. Technology certainly plays a key, and you've got to be savvy enough on phones and computers and keep up with technology, and that's going to be a must and an expense on student body as well. Yeah. It's also tough on us parents to keep up and try and get ahead of our kids. Oftentimes we find the younger kids are actually well ahead of us in terms of technology, and it's quite interesting to see. And then we meandered into Japanese fax machines, which was another conversation, perhaps for another time. But those are some of the things that we talked about.
That's an amazing tangent that you all went off on, Mark. I love that.
Well, you know me. I tend to take us down a rabbit hole that I shouldn't do, but
you live on a tangent. But I love that. I love that attention to both formal learning and informal learning, and how important they both are. Thank you for that. Another group.
We had a great conversation as well. We talked about how Zoom obviously is here to stay in a lot of levels, and how we are rethinking with technology, how that human connection, really, how we can use that in the future so that a student can thrive and take ownership of their own education in a lot of ways. The concept of education has a sense of place. You can change your level of time, shift the time that you take your education if you can do it offline on your own versus with the group in one big room like we used to do. And that has benefits, just like we think of as our extra professional development kind of stuff. The students can also add extra elements to their school if they need to catch up or if they want to get ahead. That adds a whole nother level that we can do now. The fact that you can pause and repeat with the technology is just like we all do with television and even YouTube videos while we're learning. That's also happening in education, and that is happening in tandem. And then the fact that we can do what we need to do as necessary with the technology really changes the dynamic going forward.
That was great, Andrea. I loved every little bit of that. I love the pause and repeat, and the fact that you use the word thrive, right? Because that's what we all need to do emotionally and intellectually and psychologically. It's about thriving. Thank you for that. That was fantastic. Anybody else?
Yeah. I was gonna put my group on the spot because I
Okay,
think we had some great discussions about space. So Allison, I'm putting you on the spot here, but I just thought it was such great conversation that you could share.
No, thank you, Fred. Yes, we had some really lively discussion, starting with talking about how there might be new demands for the teacher's workplace. So educators are seeing what workplaces are doing for their employees and might be, demanding some of the same, different types of rooms where they can collaborate, amenities similar to workplace design, like pantries and lounges, and really sharing that focus or that value on space between the students and the faculty. We also talked about, the building being cared for by the community. There's education buildings all over the US that are falling apart. And a lot of times it's because the community, not everyone is involved in that building. So they may not realize that it needs funding, it needs care. And so one way to look at it is make it a 24/7 community destination. And, it might be K through 12 during the day, and then it might be, dedicated purposely for continuing education or community education at night, but also maybe a place for young people to gather. A lot of times, young people don't have a great place to gather after hours and have fun together, learn together, study together. So there's that. And then another really interesting concept is, we are all experiencing stress and trauma in a way like never before. And designing for human resiliency is going to be really important, both for the teachers and students. So having spaces dedicated to mindfulness or rejuvenation and recouping, when we enter our buildings, there may be more protocol and barriers that you have to get through in order to enter that building. Some may need some space to kind of regroup after, getting searched because of the mass shootings, thermometer, hand sanitizer, all of that can be really jarring before you enter a space. So providing those spaces to regroup and recharge.
That's great, Allison. Yeah, like a reset room just to recover from whatever intrusive event has occurred. That's fantastic. Thank you. And I know Kristen.
Yes. Yeah. So our group had some good conversations too. When we were talking about it, we again, like other groups, You know, we were talking about how it really does depend on the age group. Pre-K through 8th grade probably won't be doing a lot of virtual things in the future when they can be in person 100% of the time. But for higher ed and even some high school, it might change a little more. And kind of how do we use technology to make education a little more personal, but enabled by technology? You know, thinking about peers getting together, classmates getting together over coffee to talk about what they've learned. How could we do that virtually with breakout rooms and things like that? You know, we also talked about how it's going to play a larger role, but there does need to be more training and support for staff and for students. And then we also kind of touched upon the fact that we as adults are getting the flexibility now more and more to kind of figure out when we want to go into the office and how often we want to go into the office. But students are going to, they might not be getting those opportunities as much, especially those younger students. You know, will children who are thriving with e-learning be able to get more of those experiences in the future?
Excellent. Perfect. Thank you, Kristen. Royce, I just want to make sure I touched on all the groups.
We had my group as well.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah. So we talked about a lot about a strong emphasis on the fact that place matters. Obviously, we're all place-centric people, but that place matters and that sense of place is very important to students. So that idea of trying to draw students back in where they don't seem to be as fearful, maybe as adults in the workplace are about coming back. The students are a little bit more excited about coming back and having that experience. And we kind of naturally got into the idea of technology. I didn't have to ask the second question. Our conversation kind of went there organically. But that idea that moving into that hybrid model is going to really help some students. We've seen some people that have really thrived in an online experience or work from home experience type situation, those personality types that maybe weren't shining quite as much before. So that idea that how can we create these situations where we can continue to nurture those types of students, but also bring back the ones that are the social butterflies that need the schedule, that need the interaction with each other. And how can we make both of those work within the same organization?
Oh, perfect. Nicely said. Thank you for that. All right, did we get everybody? I think we did. All right, perfect. Thank you all so much. We talked a little bit, I was in the group with Kristen and we talked about a little bit about how the peer-to-peer learning is how so many of us learn best when we're able to do these kind of small groups. And so thank you all for participating in the breakout groups and for pulling out even more information. I want to thank Patricia and Dave and Fiona and Dr. Lauren for inspiring us and informing us. We could probably do 4 more parts to this conversation. The world of education is vast and rapidly changing and dynamic, as is technology, and the human place between education and technology is that frontier that we're all navigating. And a special thank you to Dr. Lauren for your work in this area and for informing us. And thank you to Mohawk for so brilliantly convening these important conversations, essentially about place and the places where we thrive and learn and are resilient human beings. Royce, anything you want to add to wrap us up?
Well, I want to echo your thanks and our thanks to the panel. And to all of you for joining us and being part of the discussion and our journey to figuring out what's next in our crazy world. And Cheryl, I want to thank you for being our moderator and co-hosting with us. It's always a pleasure. And I hope everybody has a great upcoming weekend and stay safe and healthy and be well and thrive, right?
Yep, thrive. Stay safe and healthy. Thank you, everybody.